I will never forget the sound Victoria made when the lawyer finished reading that letter. It wasn't a scream. It wasn't a gasp. It was this low, guttural moan, like something had been ripped out of her chest. And then her legs gave out, just folded underneath her like they were made of paper. Her daughter Megan caught her right before she hit the floor, and the two of them collapsed together onto the carpet of that lawyer's office, clinging to each other like the room was flooding and there was nothing left to hold on to. And me? I was sitting 3 chairs away, completely still, with tears running down my face. Not because I was happy, not because I felt victorious, because the woman who had loved me more than my own mother ever did was gone. And her final words, the ones that lawyer had just read out loud to everyone in that room, proved that she had seen everything. Every single thing. For 12 years. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me start from the beginning. Because if you don't know what those 12 years looked like, that letter won't mean anything to you. And trust me, you need to understand every detail to feel what I felt in that room. My name is Lily. I was 24 when I met David. We worked at the same company, different floors. He was in project management, I was in accounting. The first time I saw him was in the elevator. He was holding 2 coffees and trying to press the button with his elbow, and he looked so ridiculous that I laughed out loud before I could stop myself. He looked at me, and instead of being embarrassed, he just grinned and said, "I have 2 coffees and 0 hands. This is my life now." I pressed the button for him. He said thank you. And that was it. That was the whole beginning. We started dating 3 months later. He was kind, genuinely kind. The kind of man who remembers what you said 2 weeks ago about wanting to try that new Thai place, and then just shows up with a reservation. The kind of man who holds your hand in the car without thinking about it. I fell in love with him fast, and honestly, I fell in love with him easy. There was nothing complicated about David. He was warm and steady, and he made me feel safe. What I didn't know, what I couldn't have known, was that the warmth and steadiness came at a cost. David was warm because someone in his life was ice cold. And he was steady because he had spent his entire childhood learning how to absorb chaos without reacting to it. That someone was his mother, Victoria. I met her for the first time 6 months into our relationship. David had been putting it off, and I should have paid more attention to that. When your boyfriend keeps finding reasons not to introduce you to his family, that's not shyness. That's a warning. But eventually, there was a family dinner we couldn't avoid. His mother's birthday. David drove us to the house, and I remember his hands were tight on the steering wheel the whole way. I was nervous too, but excited. I had bought her flowers, lilies, because David told me she liked them. We walked in. The house was beautiful, big, traditional, tastefully decorated. Victoria came down the hallway in a cream-colored blouse, pearls at her neck, hair perfect. She looked like she had been prepared for a photo shoot, not a family dinner. She hugged David, and it was a real hug, long and warm. Then she turned to me. She looked at the flowers in my hand. She looked at my face. And she said, "Oh, you brought grocery store flowers. That's sweet." That was it.
No hug. No handshake.
No, nice to meet you. Just a comment about my flowers that made me feel like I had tracked mud into her house. David squeezed my hand. He whispered, "She's like that with everyone at first." But I caught the look in his eyes. He knew it wasn't true. Dinner was worse. His sister Megan was there with her husband Bradley. Megan was 2 years older than David, and she had clearly inherited whatever gene Victoria carried that made her believe the world owed her something. She asked me what I did. I said accounting. She said, "Oh, how practical," in a voice that made practical sound like a disease. Victoria spent the dinner talking about Megan's house, Megan's vacation, Megan's children. Every time David tried to bring me into the conversation, Victoria would nod politely and then steer it right back. I didn't exist at that table. I was furniture. But then, right at the end of the night, something happened that changed everything. We were getting ready to leave when a voice came from the living room. "David, bring that girl in here." I haven't met her yet. David's face changed. He smiled for the first time all evening. A real smile. He took my hand and led me through the hallway into a large living room where an older woman was sitting in an armchair by the window. She had white hair pinned up loosely, a wool cardigan, and reading glasses pushed up on her forehead. She looked like someone who had been beautiful her entire life and had simply stopped caring about it. This was Eleanor, David's grandmother, Victoria's mother. She looked at me, not past me, not through me,
At me.
and she said, "So you're the one who makes my grandson's voice go soft on the phone." I felt my throat tighten. No one in that family had said anything kind to me all evening, and this woman I had known for 5 seconds saw me more clearly than any of them. David introduced us. Eleanor patted the chair next to her and told me to sit. She asked me about my work, about where I grew up, about my family. She listened. Not the polite, waiting for her turn to talk listening that Victoria did. Real listening. The kind where someone's eyes stay on yours and they ask follow-up questions that prove they actually heard what you said. When we finally left that night, I told David, "Your grandmother is wonderful." He nodded and said, "She's the best person in this family. She always has been." I didn't understand the weight of that statement then. I would, eventually. David and I got married a year later. Small wedding, which Victoria never forgave me for. She wanted a big event. 300 guests, a country club, the whole thing. I wanted something intimate. 50 people, a garden, real food, real music. David sided with me, quietly, the way he always did. Not with a big stand, not with a speech. He just said, "Mom, it's her day too," and left it at that. Victoria came to the wedding with a face that could curdle milk. She wore white. I know. But here's the thing. I didn't care. I really didn't. Because on that day, the only thing I saw was David at the end of that aisle, looking at me like I was the only person in the world. And sitting in the second row, in a beautiful lavender dress, was Eleanor. She caught my eye as I walked past and she winked. She actually winked at me. And I almost started laughing right there in the middle of my own wedding. If you're listening to this and you've ever dealt with a mother-in-law who decided on day one that you weren't good enough, you know exactly what I'm about to describe. If this story is hitting close to home, drop a like. Because what happened next, what happened over the next 12 years, I have a feeling you'll recognize every single scene. The first year of marriage was the trial period. Not for David and me.
We were solid.
But for Victoria. She was testing me, seeing how far she could push before I snapped. It started small. Comments about my cooking when she came over for dinner. "Oh, you use Jared sauce? I always make mine from scratch, but I'm sure this is fine." Comments about the house we rented. "It's cozy. Not a lot of storage, is there?" Comments about my body after I gained a few pounds over the holidays. "You look healthy, Lily. Very healthy." Each one was wrapped in a smile. Each one was said in front of David. And each one was designed so that if I reacted, I would look oversensitive. That was Victoria's genius. She never said anything that was obviously cruel. She said things that were cruel in a way that only the target could feel. Megan was less subtle. She would show up unannounced and rearrange things in my kitchen, then say she was just trying to help. She would buy me clothes for Christmas that were 2 sizes too big and say, "I wasn't sure about your size, you seem to fluctuate." She would invite David to family events and then act surprised when I showed up too. "Oh, I didn't realize you were coming. I only made reservations for 4. And David? David loved me. I never doubted that. But David had been raised in that house. He had spent 30 years learning that the path of least resistance was the only path that didn't end in a screaming match with his mother. He would hold my hand in the car afterward and say, "I know she's difficult.
I'm sorry."
But he wouldn't confront her. He wouldn't draw a line. He would comfort me after the damage was done, but he would never stop the damage from happening. I don't say this to make David the villain. He wasn't. He was a good man trapped in a pattern he couldn't see clearly enough to break. I loved him. I still love him. But I spent 12 years wishing he would stand up and say, "Mom, that's enough." He never did. Not once. The second year, it escalated. Victoria started hosting Sunday dinners and inviting everyone except me. She would call David on Friday and say, "Dinner on Sunday, just family." And David would go. He would come home afterward feeling guilty, and I would sit in our empty house wondering what version of family I had married into. I remember one Sunday, about 18 months in, David was at his mother's house, and I was home alone. It was raining. I was sitting on the couch watching nothing, feeling sorry for myself, when my phone rang. It was Eleanor. "Are you busy?" she asked. "No," I said. "David's at Sunday dinner." There was a pause. A long one. Then Eleanor said, "I know. That's why I'm calling you. I made too much soup and I don't like eating alone. Come over." I drove to Eleanor's apartment. She lived alone in a two-bedroom place about 20 minutes from Victoria's house. She had moved there after her husband Harold passed away 5 years before I met David. The apartment was small and warm and filled with books and photographs and a particular smell that I can only describe as lavender and old paper. She had indeed made soup, chicken and dumplings from scratch. We sat at her little kitchen table, and she didn't say a single word about Victoria or the dinner, or why I was excluded. She talked about a book she was reading. She asked me about a project I was working on. She told me a story about Harold, about how he once got lost driving to their honeymoon hotel, and they ended up at a dairy farm, and the farmer's wife made them breakfast while Harold studied the map upside down. I laughed so hard I cried. And then I just cried. And Eleanor reached across the table and held my hand and said, "You don't have to explain. I know." 2 words. I know. And somehow they contained everything. That was the night our friendship started. Not a grandmother-in-law and her grandson's wife. A friendship. A real one. But the family didn't see it that way. To them, I was wasting Eleanor's time. Victoria actually said that to David once. I overheard it on a phone call. "I don't know why your wife keeps bothering my mother. She has her own family." Except I didn't have my own family. My parents had passed away when I was in college. A car accident, both of them, gone in one night. David knew this. Victoria knew this. She said it anyway. That's the thing about people like Victoria. They know where your wounds are. They just choose to press on them. By year 3, the pattern was set. Family holidays were performances, where I was the understudy nobody wanted on stage. Megan's kids were the stars. Megan's husband Bradley was welcomed like royalty. And I was the woman who happened to be sitting next to David, tolerated but never included. Thanksgiving was the worst. Victoria hosted every year, and every year she made it clear that I was a guest, not a member. She would set the table with name cards, and mine was always at the far end, next to whoever's +1 she cared least about. One year, she put me at a separate small table near the kitchen. She said, "We ran out of room," even though there were 2 empty chairs at the main table. I helped in the kitchen every single time. I arrived early, I peeled, I chopped, I cleaned. And every single time, when everyone sat down and Victoria made her little speech about gratitude and family, she thanked Megan for helping. Only Megan, who had arrived 30 minutes before dinner and spent that time on her phone. David would squeeze my knee under the table. That was his version of standing up for me. A squeeze under the table that nobody could see. Christmas was no better. Victoria had a tradition of giving everyone a gift that she had specifically chosen for them. A way of showing how well she knew her family. Megan would get cashmere, jewelry, first editions. David would get watches, leather goods, thoughtful things. And I would get a candle. Every year. A candle. Not even a nice one. The kind you buy at the checkout counter, because you forgot someone was coming. One Christmas, year 4, she gave me a cookbook. It was called Simple Meals for Beginners. Megan laughed. Victoria said, "I thought it might be helpful, since David says you're still learning." David had never said that. I was a good cook. Victoria knew I was a good cook because she had eaten my food dozens of times.
But the point was never the gift.
The point was the message. You are less than. You are not one of us. You are tolerated. And through all of this, through every holiday and every dinner and every sideways comment, there was Eleanor. Watching. Saying almost nothing. But watching.
I know that now.
I didn't know it then. I just thought she was a kind old woman who liked my company. I didn't realize she was keeping score. The middle years, 5 through 8, were when things got truly ugly. Not because the insults got worse, although they did, but because something shifted in me. I stopped expecting it to get better. And when you stop expecting kindness from people who are supposed to be your family, something inside you goes quiet. Not peaceful quiet. Empty quiet. Megan had her third child, and Victoria threw a massive baby shower. 60 people, catered food, a string quartet in the backyard. I wasn't invited. David found out and confronted Victoria for the first time in our marriage. She said, it was an oversight. An oversight. 60 people and a string quartet, but my invitation was an oversight. David apologized to me. He held me while I cried. But he still went to the shower. That same year, we found out I couldn't have children. It was a medical thing, nothing that could be fixed. David and I grieved together privately, the way you do when something breaks that you didn't know could break. We talked about adoption, about other paths. We were going to be okay. We had each other. But Victoria found out.
I don't know how.
Maybe David told her in a vulnerable moment. Maybe Megan overheard something. But at the next family dinner, Victoria looked at me across the table and said, "It's such a shame about the children's situation, Lily. But honestly, maybe it's a blessing. Parenting isn't for everyone." The table went silent. David's fork stopped halfway to his mouth. Megan looked down at her plate. Even Bradley, who usually had the emotional range of a brick, looked uncomfortable. I didn't cry.
I didn't react.
I excused myself, walked to the bathroom, locked the door, and stood there for 10 minutes, staring at my own face in the mirror, wondering what I had done to deserve this woman in my life. When I came out, Eleanor was standing in the hallway. She wasn't looking at me with pity. She was looking at me with something else. Something harder. Something that looked like anger. She took my hand. She said, "Walk me to the car." We walked outside, slowly, because Eleanor's knees were bad by then. We got to her car. She didn't get in. She turned to me and said, "Lily, I want you to remember something. People who hurt others always believe they'll never have to pay for it. They're always wrong. Always." Then she squeezed my hand, got in the car, and drove away. I stood in that driveway for a long time, watching her taillights disappear. I didn't know what she meant. Not yet. After that night in the driveway, something changed between Eleanor and me. I started visiting her more often. Not just when David was at Sunday dinners I wasn't invited to. I started going on my own on weekday afternoons, sometimes after work, sometimes on my days off.
It wasn't planned.
It wasn't a schedule. I just found myself driving to her apartment the way you find yourself reaching for a glass of water. Because you need it. Eleanor never asked why I came. She never said, "You're here again?" or "Don't you have somewhere to be?" She would open the door, look at me, and say something like, "Good." I just put the kettle on, as if she had been expecting me. And maybe she had. Maybe she always was. We developed a routine that wasn't really a routine. I would come in, she would make tea, and we would sit in her small living room, the one with the bay window that looked out onto a row of maple trees. She had 2 armchairs angled toward each other, with a small table in between where she kept a stack of crossword puzzles and a porcelain teapot that had belonged to her mother. I always sat in the green chair. She always sat in the blue one. And we would talk. Not about Victoria. Not about the family. That was the unspoken rule. Eleanor never brought them up, and I learned not to either. Instead, we talked about everything else. Books, mostly. Eleanor was a ferocious reader. She went through 2 or 3 books a week, and her taste was wide. Russian novels one week, detective fiction the next, then a biography of a jazz musician, then a book about the history of bread. She didn't read to impress anyone. She read because the world interested her, and she wasn't done learning about it. She would hand me books sometimes. Just press one into my hands on my way out and say, "Tell me what you think next time." It was never a recommendation exactly. It was more like she was giving me a key to a room she wanted to show me. And when I came back and told her what I thought, she would listen with this particular intensity, like my opinion genuinely mattered to her. Not in a patronizing way. In the way of someone who respects you enough to disagree with you. We disagreed a lot, actually. About books, about politics, about whether soup needs bread on the side, or whether that's redundant. She thought bread with soup was essential. I thought it was filler. We argued about this multiple times, and each time she would shake her head and say, Harold would have sided with me, and I would say, Harold put a map upside down and ended up at a dairy farm, so I'm not sure his judgment is the gold standard. And she would laugh. Not a polite laugh. A real one. The kind that crinkles your whole face and makes you look 20 years younger. Those afternoons saved me. I don't say that lightly. Those afternoons in that apartment with that woman and those two armchairs and that porcelain teapot saved my life. Not in the dramatic sense. Nobody was pulling me from a burning building, but in the quiet sense. The sense where a person can drown in their own house, in their own marriage, surrounded by people who are supposed to love them, and the only thing keeping their head above water is one person who sees them. Really sees them. Eleanor saw me. She told me about her own life during those visits. Not all at once. In pieces, over months, over years. She had married Harold when she was 21. His family hadn't approved of her. She came from a working-class family, and Harold's parents were well off. His mother, a woman named Catherine, had told Harold that Eleanor was beneath the family's standards. I sat at that woman's dinner table for 15 years, Eleanor told me once, stirring her tea, and she never once asked me a question about myself. Not one. She talked at me, she talked around me, she talked about me when she thought I couldn't hear. But she never talked to me.
Sitter her.
That sounds familiar, I said. Eleanor looked at me over the rim of her teacup. I know it does, she said. Why do you think I'm telling you? The parallels were impossible to miss once she started drawing them. Catherine had excluded Eleanor from family events. Catherine had given her cheap gifts while showering Harold's sister with expensive ones. Catherine had made comments about Eleanor's cooking, her clothes, her education, her worth. And Harold, like David, had been kind but passive. He loved Eleanor, but he didn't fight for her. Not until it was almost too late. What changed? I asked her one afternoon. It was fall. The maple trees outside her window were turning, and the light in the room was gold. Eleanor set down her cup. Catherine got sick, she said. And Harold's sister disappeared. Suddenly, the woman who had spent 20 years telling me I wasn't family needed someone to drive her to appointments, to sit with her during treatments, to hold her hand when she was afraid. And I did it. Every single time. Not because I forgave her. Because it was the right thing to do. Did she ever apologize? Eleanor smiled. It was a complicated smile. On her last day, she said. She grabbed my hand and said, I was wrong about you. That was it. 4 words. 20 years of cruelty, and 4 words at the end. Was it enough? Eleanor looked out the window for a long time. No, she said. But it was something. And sometimes something is all you get. I thought about that conversation for weeks. I turned it over and over in my head like a stone in my pocket. Because the lesson wasn't about forgiveness. It wasn't about being the bigger person. The lesson was that Eleanor had survived. She had endured a mother-in-law who tried to erase her, and she had outlasted her. Not with revenge. Not with confrontation. With patience and presence and the quiet, stubborn act of showing up. I didn't know it then, but Eleanor was showing me my own future. She was handing me a mirror and saying, this is who you're going to have to be. Around year 7, Eleanor started doing something I didn't understand at the time. She started asking me questions. Not the usual questions. Strange ones. Specific ones. One afternoon, out of nowhere, she said, Lily, if you had a large sum of money, what would you do with it? I laughed. How large are we talking? Large enough that you wouldn't have to work anymore. I thought about it. I'd pay off her house, I said. Set up college funds for Megan's kids. Maybe open a small bakery.
I've always wanted to try that.
Megan's kids, Eleanor repeated. You'd set up funds for them?
Of course, I said.
They're David's nieces and nephew. They're family. Eleanor nodded slowly. She wrote something in a small notebook she kept on the side table. I didn't think anything of it. She was always writing things down. Shopping lists, book titles, crossword answers. I assumed it was one of those. It wasn't. A few weeks later, she asked another one. If someone in the family needed help, real help, a health crisis or a financial emergency, and no one else stepped up, what would you do? I'd help, I said immediately. Why wouldn't I? Even if it was someone who had been unkind to you? I paused. I knew she was talking about Victoria. Or Megan. Maybe both. Yes, I said. Even then, being unkind to someone who's suffering doesn't make you strong. It just makes you like them. Eleanor's pen moved across the notebook again. She looked up at me, and there was something in her eyes that I couldn't read. Pride, maybe, or confirmation of something she had already suspected. If this story is making you think of someone in your own life, someone who quietly sees everything while everyone else is too loud and too selfish to notice, leave a comment. Tell me about your Eleanor, because I think more of us have one than we realize. We just don't always appreciate them until it's too late. The questions kept coming over the next year. They weren't always direct. Sometimes they were wrapped in stories. Eleanor would tell me about a friend of hers whose children were fighting over her estate while she was still alive. They're picking over my bones, the friend had told Eleanor, and I'm not even dead yet. Then Eleanor would look at me and say, "What would you do if you were that woman?" Or she would mention a news story about a family that fell apart over an inheritance, and she would ask, "Do you think money reveals who people are, or do you think it changes them?" Reveals, I said without hesitation. Money doesn't change anyone. It just gives them permission to be who they always were. Eleanor smiled at that one. A real smile. And that notebook came out again. I should have realized what was happening. Looking back, the signs were everywhere. But I wasn't looking for signs. I was just spending time with a woman I loved. I didn't know I was being interviewed. While Eleanor was quietly taking notes, the rest of the family was putting on a show that would have been funny if it weren't so painful. Year 8 brought what I think of as the lake house incident. Victoria's family had a lake house upstate. It had been in the family for decades, originally bought by Eleanor and Harold in the 70s. When Harold died, Eleanor transferred the deed to Victoria, her only child. It was supposed to stay in the family. Everyone was supposed to use it. Everyone did use it. Except me. Every summer, Victoria organized a 2-week family trip to the lake house. David, Megan, Bradley, the kids. It was the highlight of their year. And every year, I was technically invited but practically excluded. Victoria would set the dates without consulting me, always during my busiest period at work. She would assign bedrooms and put David in the room he had as a teenager, a room with a twin bed. "There's no room for a couple in there," she would say. "Lily can sleep on the pull-out in the den." One year, I actually went. I took time off work, drove up with David, determined to make it good. I lasted 4 days. Victoria criticized every meal I tried to help cook. Megan sunbathed while I watched her kids. Bradley drank beer on the dock and called it family bonding. And at night, I lay on a pull-out sofa with a metal bar digging into my spine, listening to everyone else sleeping in real beds in real rooms, and I stared at the ceiling and wondered why I kept trying. On the 5th morning, I packed my bag. David asked me to stay. I said, "I love you, but I can't be here." He nodded. He didn't argue. He didn't offer to come with me. He just nodded. I drove home alone. 4 hours in the car with nothing but the road and my thoughts. And somewhere around hour 2, my phone buzzed. It was a text from Eleanor. "I heard you left the lake house."
Good.
"That place has bad energy. Come have soup." I drove straight to her apartment. That evening, sitting in the green chair with a bowl of tomato soup in my hands, I finally broke. Not about the lake house. About everything. I told Eleanor all of it. Every Christmas candle, every excluded dinner, every comment about my cooking and my body and my inability to have children. I told her about the baby shower I wasn't invited to. I told her about the name cards at Thanksgiving that put me at the kids' table. I told her about Victoria wearing white to my wedding. All of it. 12 years of swallowed pain, coming up like a flood. Eleanor listened to every word. She didn't interrupt. She didn't gasp or shake her head or say, "That's terrible." She just listened, with her hands folded in her lap and her eyes steady on mine. When I finished, I was exhausted.
Empty.
I said, "I'm sorry. I shouldn't have dumped all that on you. She's your daughter." Eleanor was quiet for a moment. Then she said something I will carry with me until the day I die. Lily, I love my daughter. But love does not require blindness. I see exactly who Victoria is. I have seen it for a very long time. And I see exactly who you are. Don't apologize for telling the truth to someone who already knows it. She stood up, slowly, the way she did when her knees were bothering her. She walked to the bookshelf in the corner and pulled out a leather-bound journal. She held it against her chest for a moment, then she put it back. Not yet, she said, more to herself than to me. But soon. I didn't ask what she meant. I wish I had. But I think, even if I had asked, she wouldn't have told me. Eleanor had a plan. She had probably had it for years. And she wasn't going to reveal it until she was ready. What I didn't know, what none of us knew, was that Eleanor had been watching the entire family with the same careful attention she gave everything else in her life. Every visit from Victoria, where Victoria talked only about herself. Every time Megan showed up and spent the whole visit on her phone. Every holiday where they descended on Eleanor's apartment, ate her food, accepted her gifts, and left without asking how she was doing. And every time I showed up with nothing but myself and sat in that green chair and talked to her like she was a person who mattered. She was keeping track. In that notebook, in that journal, she was documenting everything. There was a moment in year 8 that I didn't witness, but Eleanor told me about it later, and it crystallized everything. Victoria came to visit Eleanor on a Tuesday afternoon. This was unusual because Victoria almost never visited on weekdays. She came because she needed something. Eleanor's financial advisor had called Victoria by mistake, something about a document that needed Eleanor's signature, and in the process of the call, Victoria had learned something that changed her entire posture toward her mother. Eleanor was worth considerably more than anyone in the family had realized. Harold had been a quiet investor. He had made smart, conservative decisions over 40 years. By the time he died, the portfolio was substantial. Eleanor had continued managing it, carefully, with the same advisor Harold had trusted. And it had grown. Victoria came to Eleanor's apartment that Tuesday, and suddenly she was warm. Suddenly she was attentive. Suddenly she was asking how Eleanor was feeling, and whether she needed anything, and whether she had thought about updating her will. My will, Eleanor told me, her voice flat as she recounted it. She sat in that chair, your chair, and she asked me about my will. She didn't ask how my hip was doing. She didn't notice the new painting I hung last week. She asked about my will. What did you say? I asked. I told her it was taken care of. And then I offered her tea, and she stayed for 45 minutes, which is 35 minutes longer than her usual visit. Eleanor paused. She's going to tell Megan. And then they're both going to start visiting more often. Watch. She was right. Within 2 weeks, Megan started coming by on Saturdays. Bringing the kids. Bringing flowers. Bringing homemade meals that I'm fairly sure Bradley's mother had actually cooked. Suddenly, Eleanor was the center of the family's attention. Eleanor played along. She smiled. She accepted the flowers. She ate the food. She let her granddaughter hug her and tell her she was the best grandmother in the world. And then when they all left, she would call me. Megan brought chrysanthemums today, she said once, and I could hear the dry humor in her voice. She doesn't know I'm allergic. She's been my granddaughter for 38 years, and she doesn't know I'm allergic to chrysanthemums. What did you do with them? I put them in a vase in the kitchen and opened all the windows. Then I sneezed for an hour after she left. I laughed, but it wasn't really funny. It was sad. It was sad that a woman who had lived 83 years and raised a family and buried a husband and read 1,000 books and made the best chicken soup I had ever tasted was being reduced, by her own daughter, to a number on a balance sheet. Eleanor knew it too. And she wasn't angry about it. Not in the way I would have been. She was something else. She was resolved. People tell you who they are, she said to me once, near the end of that year. Not with their words. Words are free. People tell you who they are with what they do when they think no one important is watching. The problem is they never know who's watching. She tapped the notebook on the side table. Just once. And then she changed the subject. Year 9 was when Eleanor started to slow down. Not dramatically. Not in a way that made you panic, but in the small ways that only someone who saw her regularly would notice. She stopped meeting me at the door. Instead, she would call out from the living room, "It's open, come in." Her tea got weaker because she couldn't grip the spoon tightly enough to stir properly. She started forgetting where she had put her reading glasses, even though they were always on her forehead. And she began to tire earlier. Our visits, which used to stretch 3 or 4 hours, started ending at 2. She would look at me around the 2-hour mark with a particular expression, not embarrassment exactly, more like frustration with her own body, and she would say, "I think I need to rest my eyes for a bit." I adjusted without saying anything. I started coming earlier, so we could have the same amount of real time together. I started making the tea myself when I arrived. I would bring groceries, not because she asked, but because I noticed her fridge was getting emptier between visits. I bought the bread she liked from the bakery on Elm Street, the sourdough with the thick crust. I bought the particular brand of Earl Grey she had been drinking for 40 years. I bought strawberries when they were in season because she once told me that Harold used to bring her strawberries every Saturday morning, and she missed that more than almost anything. She never thanked me for these things. Not with words. But she would look at the strawberries on the counter, and her face would do something complicated, something between a smile and a memory, and that was enough. The family noticed Eleanor's decline too, of course, but they noticed it differently. Victoria started talking about the future. That was her phrase. "We need to think about the future, Mom." What she meant was the house, the investments, the will. She started bringing brochures. Not for assisted living, not yet. For financial planners. For estate attorneys. For trust structures. Eleanor told me about these visits with a tone I hadn't heard from her before. Not anger. Not sadness. Weariness. "Victoria brought a man in a suit to my apartment yesterday," she said one afternoon. "And estate planner." She introduced him as a friend. He wasn't a friend. He had a briefcase and a business card, and he started asking me about my assets before I had even offered him water. "What did you do?" I told him I already had everything in order. He looked at Victoria like she had lied to him. She probably had. I asked Eleanor if she wanted me to be there during these visits. She shook her head.
No.
"I need to see how they behave when you're not in the room. It's part of the process." I didn't ask what process. By then, I had learned that Eleanor operated on her own timeline, and pushing her only made her go quieter. But I felt a tightness in my chest that I couldn't explain, like something was being set in motion that I couldn't see, and by the time it became visible, it would be too late to stop. Year 10 was the year of the hospital. Eleanor fell in her kitchen in February. She was reaching for something on a high shelf, a shelf I had told her a dozen times to stop using, and she lost her balance. Broken hip.
Surgery.
3 weeks in the hospital, then 6 weeks in a rehabilitation center. I was there every day. Every single day. I would come after work, sometimes during my lunch break. I brought her books, real ones, because she hated reading on a screen. I brought her crossword puzzles from the newspaper. I brought her the Earl Grey, which the nurses let me brew in their break room because they were kind and because Eleanor had charmed every single one of them within the first 48 hours. We would sit in her hospital room, her in the bed, me in the chair beside it, and we would do crosswords together. She was still sharp.
Sharper than me, honestly.
She would get the answers before I had finished reading the clues, and she would wait patiently while I caught up, pretending she hadn't already figured it out. Victoria came twice. Once on the day of the surgery, when the doctors were there and there were forms to sign and decisions to make. And once more a week later for about 40 minutes. She brought flowers. Not chrysanthemums this time. Roses. She put them on the windowsill and spent most of the visit on her phone, then kissed Eleanor's forehead and said, "I'll come back soon, Mom." She didn't come back for 3 weeks. Megan came once. She brought the kids, who were loud and uncomfortable in the hospital room, and she left after 20 minutes because the youngest was hungry. She didn't come back at all. Do you know what it's like to sit in a hospital room with someone you love and watch the door, knowing that the people who should be walking through it aren't going to? The door opens and it's a nurse. The door opens and it's an orderly with a tray. The door opens and it's a physical therapist. But it's never the daughter. It's never the granddaughter. The door opens and opens and opens, and the people who share this woman's blood never walk through it. Eleanor didn't complain. She never complained. But I saw it. I saw the way her eyes would flick to the door every time it opened, and I saw the tiny flicker of something, hope maybe, or habit, and then the settling back. The acceptance. The quiet understanding that the people she had raised and fed and loved and housed for decades had done the math and decided that a hospital visit wasn't worth their time. I hated them for that. I know hate is a strong word. I don't use it often. But sitting in that hospital room on a Tuesday night, watching Eleanor pretend she wasn't waiting for her daughter to call, I hated Victoria with a clarity that surprised me. One night during the rehab weeks, I was helping Eleanor into bed. She was stronger by then, moving better, but she still needed a hand. I was adjusting her pillows the way she liked them, two behind her back and one thin one under her knees, when she grabbed my wrist.
Lily, she said.
Her voice was different.
Urgent.
I need you to do something for me. Anything, I said. In my apartment, in the top drawer of the desk in my bedroom, there's a manila envelope. Don't open it. Just make sure it's still there. And if anything happens to me, take it to Robertson. He's my attorney. His card is inside the envelope. Eleanor, nothing is going to happen to you. You're getting stronger every day. She looked at me with those steady eyes. I am getting stronger, she said. But I'm also 85. Promise me. I promised. I drove to her apartment the next morning and checked. The envelope was there, thick, sealed, with Robertson, attorney at law, written on the front in Eleanor's careful handwriting. I didn't open it. She asked me not to, so I didn't. I wish I had. Not because it would have changed anything, but because I would have had time to prepare myself for what was inside. Eleanor came home from rehab in April. She was thinner, slower, but she was Eleanor. She still made tea, although I noticed she had switched from the heavy porcelain pot to a lighter ceramic one. She still read 2 books a week. She still sat in the blue chair and argued with me about bread and soup. But something had shifted. She talked about Harold more. She talked about the past more. Not in a morbid way. In a gathering way. Like she was collecting her memories, holding them up to the light one more time before putting them somewhere safe. She also started giving me things. Small things. A silk scarf she said didn't suit her anymore. A first edition of a novel we had both loved. A recipe card, handwritten, for her chicken and dumpling soup. You'll want this someday, she said, handing me the card. Don't lose it. I took everything she gave me and I didn't argue because I understood what she was doing, even if I didn't want to admit it. She was distributing pieces of herself. Not the valuable things, not the things Victoria would fight over.
The real things.
The things that mattered. Year 11 was quiet. Eleanor had good days and bad days. On good days, we would sit in the living room and she would tell me stories I had never heard. About traveling through Europe with Harold in the 60s. About a summer she spent in Greece when she was 19 before she met him. When she worked in a bookshop on a tiny island and fell in love with a fisherman's son who wrote her poems in a language she couldn't read. About her mother, who had worked in a textile factory and could sew anything, anything at all, and who died at 62 with hands that looked like they belonged to a woman twice her age. On bad days, Eleanor didn't want to talk. She would sit in the blue chair with a blanket over her legs and look out the window at the maple trees, and I would sit in the green chair and read, and we would be quiet together. Those days were hard. Not because of the silence. Because of what the silence meant. It meant her body was winning. It meant the woman I loved was retreating, inch by inch, into a place I couldn't follow. During year 11, Victoria increased her visits to once a week. This sounds like an improvement until you understand the content of those visits. Victoria would arrive with documents. Legal documents. Financial summaries. Questions about accounts and properties and beneficiaries. She would sit in the green chair, my chair, and she would spread papers across the coffee table and say things like, "Mom, we just need to make sure everything is organized. For your peace of mind." Eleanor's peace of mind was not what Victoria was protecting. I know this because Eleanor told me what happened during those visits. She told me everything. How Victoria pushed for a new will. How Victoria suggested that Eleanor's assets should be placed in a family trust, managed by Victoria as trustee. How Victoria brought a new attorney, not Robertson, a different one, someone Victoria had chosen, and how this attorney sat in Eleanor's living room and talked about Eleanor's money as if Eleanor wasn't in the room. He kept looking at Victoria when he spoke, Eleanor said. Not at me. As if she were his client. She's not his client. I am not his client either. Robert Chun is my attorney. Has been for 30 years. This man was Victoria's puppet. What did you do? Eleanor smiled. That complicated smile. I told him that my estate planning was complete, that it had been complete for quite some time, and that if he had any further questions, he could direct them to Robertson. How did Victoria react? She turned the color of a plum. Then she smiled and said, Of course, Mom. I just want to make sure you're taken care of. As if I don't know the difference between being taken care of and being managed. I asked Eleanor, gently, if she had told Victoria what was in the will. She shook her head. Victoria assumes she knows, Eleanor said. She assumes the house goes to her. The investments get split between her and the grandchildren, and everything else is details. She has assumed this her entire life. That is the problem with assumptions, Lily. They make you lazy. And lazy people don't pay attention to the things that matter. Year 12 was the last. Eleanor turned 87 in March. I brought her a cake. Lemon, her favorite. I brought candles, 87 of them, which was a fire hazard and a logistical nightmare, but she laughed so hard when she saw them that it was worth every minute I spent pressing tiny candles into frosting. We ate cake. We drank tea. She told me the fisherman's son story again, the one from Greece, and I didn't tell her she had told me before because the way she told it, the light in her eyes when she talked about those poems in a language she couldn't read, was something I wanted to see as many times as I could. In May, she got sick. Pneumonia. At her age, with her lungs, it was serious. She went to the hospital. I went with her. I rode in the ambulance because there was no one else to ride with her, and the paramedic asked if I was her daughter, and I said, I'm her granddaughter-in-law, and he nodded like that explained everything. She spent 2 weeks in the hospital. I was there every day again. Same chair, same crossword puzzles, same Earl Grey from the nurse's break room. But this time felt different. The air in the room was different. Eleanor was different. She was quieter, further away, like she was already beginning the journey out of this world, and she was just waiting for her body to catch up with her decision. Victoria came more this time. Not out of love, I don't think. Out of awareness. She could see what I could see. The end was visible. And Victoria needed to make sure everything was in order before that end arrived. One afternoon, I arrived at the hospital and found Victoria already there. She was sitting beside Eleanor's bed, holding her hand, and for one brief moment, I thought maybe I had been wrong about her. Maybe she did love her mother. Maybe the money and the manipulation and the estate attorneys were just her way of processing fear. Then I heard what she was saying. Mom, I just need to know that Robert Chen has the current version. The most recent one. You updated it, right? After we talked. Eleanor's eyes were closed. Her breathing was shallow. And Victoria was asking about the will. I must have made a sound, because Victoria turned and saw me in the doorway. She straightened up. She let go of Eleanor's hand. She smiled at me, that beauty queen smile she had perfected over 60 years of performing. Lily, she said. I was just sitting with Mom. She's resting. I didn't say anything. I walked past her, sat in the chair on the other side of the bed, and took Eleanor's hand. The hand Victoria had just dropped. Victoria stayed for another 10 minutes, then left. She didn't say goodbye to me. She never did. That night, Eleanor opened her eyes. She looked at me, and she said, You heard her. Yes, I said. Don't be angry, Eleanor said. I'm not angry. I've had a long time to make my peace with who my daughter is. I don't know how you can be so calm about it. Eleanor squeezed my hand. Weakly, barely. But I felt it. Because it's already done, she said. Everything is already done. It has been for a long time. All that's left now is the telling. She closed her eyes again. I sat with her until midnight. The nurses brought me a blanket. I fell asleep in the chair. Eleanor came home from a hospital in June. She came home, but she wasn't the same. She needed a caregiver now, someone to help her with the things her body could no longer manage on its own. Victoria hired someone, a woman named Diana, who was competent and professional and kind. But Diana was not family. Diana went home at 5 o'clock. I came after 5 o'clock. I came every evening. I would cook dinner, something simple, something soft enough for Eleanor to eat without difficulty. I would sit with her in the living room.
Sometimes we talked.
Sometimes we didn't. The crossword puzzle stopped because Eleanor's hands shook too much to hold a pen. The book stopped because her eyes tired too quickly. But we still had the chairs. We still had the window. We still had each other. One evening in August, Eleanor asked me to bring her the journal. The leather-bound one from the bookshelf. The one she had reached for that night years ago, and then put back, saying, "Not yet." I brought it to her. She held it in her lap for a long time, running her fingers over the cover. Then she looked at me and said, "I started writing this the year you married David." "What is it?" "It's a record," she said, "of everything I've seen, everything that's happened in this family, every kindness, every cruelty, every lie, every truth. I wrote it all down because I knew that someday, when I was gone, someone would try to rewrite the story. Someone always tries to rewrite the story. And I wanted the truth to exist somewhere permanent." She handed the journal to me. "I want you to read this after I'm gone," she said. "Not before."
After.
"Promise me." I promised. I took the journal home and put it in my bedside drawer, and I didn't open it.
Just like the envelope.
Because Eleanor asked me not to, and I had never broken a promise to her. Eleanor passed away on a Saturday in October. I was there. Diana had called me at 4 in the morning and said, "You should come now." I drove through empty streets, still in my pajamas, and I let myself into the apartment with the key Eleanor had given me years ago, and I walked into the bedroom where she was lying in her bed, in clean sheets, with the lamp on because she had never liked sleeping in the dark. She was still breathing when I arrived. Barely. I sat on the edge of the bed and took her hand. Her eyes were closed. I don't know if she knew I was there. I like to think she did. I talked to her. I told her about the book I was reading, a mystery she would have loved. I told her the maple trees outside were turning again, just like they did every fall. I told her the bakery on Elm Street had started making a new kind of sourdough with rosemary, and she would have had opinions about it. I told her that her chicken and dumpling soup recipe was the most valuable thing anyone had ever given me. And then I told her that she was the best person I had ever known,
That she had saved me.
that she had seen me when no one else did, that I loved her. Her breathing changed. It slowed. It became something else, something quieter than breath, and then it was gone. I sat with her for a long time. I don't know how long. The sun came up. The light came through the window the way it always did, the way it had come through 1,000 times while we sat in our chairs and drank tea and argued about bread. Diana came in at some point and stood in the doorway and didn't say anything. She just stood there giving me space. I called David.
He cried.
I called Victoria. She didn't cry. She said, "I'll handle the arrangements." The funeral was 4 days later. Victoria organized it the way she organized everything, with precision and control, and an eye toward how it would look to other people. The flowers were expensive. The venue was tasteful. The program was printed on heavy cardstock with a professional photo of Eleanor on the cover. Victoria gave the eulogy. She stood at the podium in a black dress and pearls, just like the pearls she always wore, and she talked about her mother. She talked about Eleanor's strength, her wisdom, her generosity. She talked about Sunday dinners and holiday traditions and a lifetime of love.
She didn't mention me.
Not once. 12 years of daily visits, of soup and tea and crosswords and books and conversations that kept Eleanor alive in every way that mattered, and Victoria did not say my name. I sat in the third row between David and an empty chair, and I listened to a woman rewrite history in real time. After the service, people came up to Victoria to offer condolences. They hugged Megan. They patted the children's heads. A few people nodded at me. Most didn't. But then an older man approached me. He was short, well-dressed, with silver hair and sharp eyes behind wire-framed glasses. He shook my hand and said, "You're Lily." "Yes," I said.
I'm Robert Chen.
"Eleanor's attorney. She talked about you often."
He paused.
"I'll be in touch within the week regarding the reading of the will. Please make sure you're available." He said it quietly. No one else heard. He pressed a business card into my hand and walked away. I stood there holding that card, and something in my chest that had been wound tight for days began to loosen. Not because of the will. I didn't care about money. I had never cared about money. But because Robertson had said, "She talked about you often." And that meant that somewhere, in some room I had never been in, Eleanor had spoken my name. She had made sure at least one other person in the world knew what I meant to her. The week after the funeral was strange. The family was already circling. Victoria called David 3 times to ask about Mom's paperwork. Megan texted him asking if he knew who had the key to Eleanor's apartment. Nobody called me. Nobody asked how I was. Nobody seemed to remember that I had been the one sitting beside Eleanor's bed when she died. David was sad. He grieved his grandmother quietly, the way he did everything, without fuss, without drama. He held me at night and cried into my shoulder, and I held him back, and we didn't talk about Victoria or the will or any of it. We just held each other in the dark and missed the same woman for different reasons. Then, on a Thursday morning, 9 days after Eleanor's death, Robert Chen's office called. The reading of the will was scheduled for the following Tuesday. All family members were requested to attend. Victoria called David within the hour. "Tuesday at 10, she said. Robert Chen's office. Wear something nice." She didn't tell David to bring me, but Robert Chen's office called me separately. A secretary, very polite, very specific. "Ms. Bennett, Mr. Chen has asked that you attend personally. It's important," I told David. He looked surprised but not concerned. "Maybe Grandma left you something," he said. "A piece of jewelry, maybe. She loved you." A piece of jewelry. That's what David thought. That's what everyone thought. A necklace, maybe.
A ring.
A keepsake from the old woman who liked her grandson's wife. Something small and sentimental that Victoria could smile at graciously before collecting the real inheritance. Nobody knew. Nobody had any idea what was coming. Tuesday came the way important days always do, quietly, without any warning in the weather or the light that your life is about to split into before and after. It was October. Cool, clear, the kind of morning where the air feels thin and sharp and everything has edges. I wore a simple black dress. Not because anyone told me to, because it still felt like morning, and I wasn't ready to wear color yet. David drove us. He was quiet in the car. He held my hand at red lights the way he always did, and I looked at his profile and thought about how much I loved this man and how little he understood about what was about to happen. I didn't understand either, not fully, but I had a feeling, a heaviness in my stomach that wasn't grief and wasn't fear. It was something closer to standing at the edge of a cliff and knowing you're about to see the view, but not knowing whether it will be beautiful or terrifying. Robert Chen's office was in a brownstone on a quiet street downtown. Old building, old money feeling, heavy wooden doors and brass fixtures, and the kind of carpet that absorbs sound so completely that you feel like you're walking through a dream. Victoria was already there when we arrived. She was sitting in the waiting area with Megan and Bradley. She was wearing a black suit, impeccable, with those pearls again, always those pearls. Megan was in a dark blue dress. Bradley was in a sport coat that didn't quite fit, tugging at the collar the way men do when they'd rather be anywhere else. Victoria looked up when David and I walked in. Her eyes moved past David and landed on me, and I saw a flicker of something. Not hostility, exactly. Confusion. She hadn't expected me to be there. She turned to David and said, "You brought Lily. That's nice. That's nice." Like I was a handbag he had chosen to accessorize with. David said, "She was invited, Mom." Mr. Chen's office called her directly. Victoria's expression didn't change, but something behind it did. A tightening, a recalculation. I could see the gears turning behind her eyes, trying to figure out why Eleanor's attorney would personally invite her son's wife to a will reading. We were shown into a conference room. Long table, leather chairs, windows overlooking the street. Robert Chin was already seated at the head of the table. He stood when we entered, shook everyone's hand, and gestured for us to sit. I ended up on one side of the table with David. Victoria, Megan, and Bradley sat across from us, like opposing teams, like a courtroom. I don't think the seating was accidental. Robert Chin sat back down, opened a leather portfolio, and looked at each of us in turn. He had a particular way of looking at people, steady and unhurried, like he was reading something written on your face that you didn't know was there. "Thank you all for coming," he said. "I know this is a difficult time, and I want to begin by saying that Eleanor was not just my client. She was my friend. I had the privilege of knowing her for over 30 years, and I want you to know that every decision reflected in the documents I'm about to read was made by Eleanor with full clarity, full intention, and over a considerable period of time. These were not last-minute choices. They were not made under duress or confusion. Eleanor knew exactly what she wanted, and she took great care to make sure it was done correctly." He said this looking at Victoria, directly at Victoria, and I understood why. He was preemptively closing every door she might try to open later. No claims of incompetence. No claims of manipulation. No claims of a confused old woman being taken advantage of. He was laying the foundation before he dropped the bomb.
Victoria smiled tightly.
"Of course," she said. "Mom was always sharp." Robert Chin nodded. He adjusted his glasses. He opened a document. "The last will and testament of Eleanor Margaret Whitfield," he began. "Dated March 15th of this year, replacing all prior versions." March 15th. Eleanor's birthday. She had finalized her will on her birthday, the birthday where I had brought 87 candles and we had eaten lemon cake, and she had told me the fisherman's son story again. She had signed this document on that day. While I was washing cake plates in her kitchen, she had already decided everything. Robert Chin read the preliminary sections. Legal language, executor appointments, instructions regarding debts and taxes. Victoria sat perfectly still, her hands folded on the table, her face arranged in an expression of patient dignity. She was waiting for the part that mattered. We all were. Then Robert Chin reached the section on specific bequests. "To my granddaughter, Megan Elizabeth Harrington, I leave the sum of $50,000 to be used at her discretion." Megan blinked. 50,000. Not nothing, but not what she had expected. I could see it on her face, the quick math, the rapid downward adjustment of whatever number she had been carrying in her head. She glanced at Victoria. Victoria didn't look at her. "To my grandson, David Andrew Whitfield, I leave the sum of $50,000, along with his grandfather's watch collection, which is currently stored in a safety deposit box at First National Bank. The key and box number are filed with this office." David's jaw tightened. Not because of the money, because of the watches. Harold's watches. David had loved his grandfather, and the idea that Eleanor had specifically set those aside for him hit something deep. He nodded once, quickly, and looked down at his hands. Robert Chin continued. "To my grandson-in-law, Bradley Thomas Harrington, I leave the sum of $10,000, with the suggestion that he invested in something that brings him joy rather than obligation." A tiny flicker of humor from the grave. Eleanor had never been impressed by Bradley, but she wasn't cruel. 10,000 and a gentle nudge. That was exactly her. "To my great-grandchildren, Connor, Sophia, and James Harrington, I establish a trust in the amount of $150,000, divided equally, to be used for their education. The trust shall be managed by Robert Chin as trustee until each child reaches the age of 25. This was significant. Not just the amount, but the trustee. Robert Chin, not Victoria, not Megan. Eleanor had made sure the money for the children would actually reach the children. Victoria shifted in her chair.
She was doing the math. 50 plus 50 plus 10 plus 150.
310,000. A lot of money by most standards, but Victoria knew the size of the full estate. She knew this was a fraction. Her posture changed, straightened, because she believed she understood the structure now. The small bequests were done. Everything else, the house, the investments, the bulk of it was coming next.
And it was coming to her.
Robert Chin paused. He took a sip of water. He looked at his papers, then looked up, and his eyes found mine. The remainder of my estate, he read, including but not limited to the property at 412 Maple Lane, all investment accounts held at Whitfield Capital Management and Fidelity Investments, all savings accounts, all personal property not otherwise specified, and all proceeds from any life insurance policies, I leave in their entirety to Lily and Bennett. The room stopped. I don't mean it went quiet. I mean it stopped. The air stopped moving. The light stopped shifting. The sounds from the street outside stopped reaching through the windows. Everything just stopped. Victoria's mouth opened. No sound came out. Her hands, still folded on the table, went white at the knuckles. Megan said, "What?" It came out high-pitched and strangled, like someone had stepped on her throat. Bradley looked at Megan, then at Victoria, then at me, and his face took on the expression of a man who has just realized he is sitting in the middle of a detonation zone. David turned to me. His eyes were wide. Not with greed, not with jealousy, with shock.
Pure un proces shock.
He hadn't known. He hadn't expected this any more than they had. I couldn't speak. I couldn't move. I sat in that leather chair and felt the room tilt around me like the floor had turned to water. Robert Chin let the silence hold for exactly as long as it needed to. Then he said, "There is more." Victoria found her voice. It came out like broken glass. More? What more could there possibly be? You just gave everything my mother owned to a woman who is not her blood. Robert Chin looked at her without flinching. "Mrs. Whitfield left a letter," he said. "She instructed me to read it aloud in the presence of all parties. Those were her explicit wishes, and I intend to honor them." "I don't want to hear a letter," Victoria said. "I want to know on what grounds my mother disinherited her own daughter. I want to know who influenced her. I want to know when this was done, and by whom, and I want it challenged, Robert. I will challenge this." Robert Chin removed his glasses, set them on the table, and looked at Victoria with an expression I can only describe as quiet authority. "Mrs. Harrington, your mother anticipated that reaction. That is precisely why this letter exists. I strongly suggest you listen to it. But if you prefer to leave, you are free to do so, and I will provide you with a copy for your records." Victoria didn't leave. She couldn't. She needed to hear it the way you need to look at a car accident. She sat back in her chair, crossed her arms over her chest, and said, "Fine. Read it." Robert Chin unfolded a second document. Handwritten. I could see the script from across the table. Eleanor's careful, elegant handwriting, the same handwriting I had seen on crossword puzzles and recipe cards, and the front of a manila envelope. He began to read. "My dear family, if Robert is reading this, then I am gone, and the decisions I made during my lifetime are now final. I want to explain them, not because I owe anyone an explanation, but because I believe in truth, and I have spent the last 12 years watching truth be a rare commodity in this family. Victoria, you are my daughter, and I love you. I have loved you from the moment you were born, and I loved you every day of your life, including the days when loving you was the hardest thing I did. But love is not the same as approval, and it is not the same as blindness. I watched you, Victoria. For 12 years, I watched how you treated Lily. I watched you exclude her from dinners she should have been welcome at. I watched you seat her at the children's table on Thanksgiving. I watched you give her grocery store candles while you gave Megan cashmere. I watched you wear white to her wedding. I watched you tell her that her inability to have children was a blessing. Yes, I heard about that. David told me, though I suspect he doesn't remember telling me. He was upset. He should have been upset enough to stop you. He wasn't. That is his failure, and I love him, but I will not pretend it isn't. I watched you, and I watched Lily. And what I saw were two very different kinds of people. I saw a woman, my daughter, who visited me when she needed something, who brought flowers she hadn't bothered to learn I was allergic to, who brought estate planners to my living room and talked about my money while I was still breathing, who came to the hospital twice during my hip surgery and asked about my will both times. And I saw a woman, not my blood, not my daughter, not even someone I had chosen, who came every day, who brought me the bread I liked and the tea I drank and the strawberries that Harold used to bring me, who sat in the green chair and argued with me about soup and read books I gave her and talked to me like I was a person, not a portfolio, who rode in the ambulance when I was afraid, who slept in a hospital chair because she didn't want me to wake up alone. Megan, I love you too. But you came to my apartment with chrysanthemums, and you have been my granddaughter for 38 years. I am allergic to chrysanthemums. That is not a small thing. That is a symbol of everything. I did not make this decision in anger. I made it in clarity. Over many years, I watched this family, and I asked myself a question that I think every person should ask before they decide where their life's work goes. The question is not who shares my blood. The question is who showed up. Not once. Not when it was convenient. Not when there was something to gain. Who showed up every single day, with nothing to gain and everything to give, simply because they loved me. The answer was always Lily. It was only ever Lily. To my daughter, I have left you something more valuable than money. I have left you this letter. I have left you the truth about who you became when you thought no one important was watching. You were wrong about that, Victoria. Someone was always watching. And I truly hope, that seeing yourself clearly, perhaps for the first time, will be the inheritance that actually changes your life. Money never would have. To Lily, I have left you everything I own because you gave me everything that mattered. You gave me your time. You gave me your attention. You gave me your laughter and your honesty and your company on 1,000 afternoons when you could have been anywhere else. You didn't do it for reward. You didn't do it for an inheritance you didn't know existed. You did it because that is who you are. I told you once that people who hurt others always believe they'll never have to pay for it, and they're always wrong. I hope you understand now what I meant. Take care of the house. Take care of the maple trees. And please, for the love of everything, learn to accept that bread belongs with soup. With all my love, and with no regrets, Eleanor. Robertson set the letter down on the table. He folded his hands. He didn't say anything. There was nothing to say. The silence that followed was the loudest thing I have ever heard. Victoria made that sound. That low, guttural moan I described at the beginning of this story. Her body folded. Megan caught her. The two of them collapsed together, Victoria's carefully constructed dignity crumbling like a building that had been hollow all along. I sat across the table with tears streaming down my face. David had his arm around me, and he was crying too, silently, the way David did everything, without noise, without drama. I looked at the letter on the table, at Eleanor's handwriting, and I could see her. I could see her sitting at that little desk in her bedroom, writing those words by hand, choosing each one with the same care she brought to everything. She had known this moment would come. She had planned it for years, not as revenge, not as punishment, as a final act of truth from a woman who believed that the truth was the most important thing a person could leave behind. Victoria composed herself eventually. She stood up. She straightened her jacket. She looked at Robertson and said, "You'll hear from my attorney." Then she looked at me, just looked at me, and in her eyes, I saw something I had never seen before. Not anger, not hatred, recognition. She saw me. For the first time in 12 years, she actually saw me. And she couldn't stand it. She walked out. Megan followed, holding her arm. Bradley trailed behind like he always did, an afterthought in a family of hurricanes. David and I sat in that conference room for another hour. Robertson walked us through the details. The house on Maple Lane, fully paid off, worth more than I could process. The investment accounts, built over Harold's lifetime and grown under Eleanor's stewardship, substantial enough that I had to ask Robertson to repeat the number twice because I was sure I had misheard. The personal property, the furniture, the books, the art, the porcelain teapot. All of it. Everything. She had left me everything. David held my hand the whole time. When we finally walked out of that building and into the October air, he stopped on the sidewalk and turned to me and said, "She was right. About all of it. And I'm sorry I wasn't braver." It was the first time in 12 years that David had acknowledged, directly, without softening, without excuses, that his family had hurt me and that he had let it happen. Standing on that sidewalk, with the wind pulling at my hair and the sun cutting through the clouds, I heard the words I had been waiting to hear for over a decade. Not from Eleanor. From him. I leaned into his chest and I cried. For Eleanor.
For us.
For everything. The weeks after the reading were what you might expect. Victoria did hire an attorney. She contested the will. It went nowhere. Robert Chun had anticipated every argument, every angle. The will was airtight. Eleanor had undergone a cognitive assessment 2 months before she signed it, at Robert Chun's suggestion, specifically to prevent any claim of diminished capacity. She had also written a separate affidavit explaining her reasoning, witnessed by 2 independent parties. Eleanor hadn't just planned this. She had fortified it. Victoria stopped speaking to David. Megan stopped speaking to David. For about 3 months, we existed in a silence that should have been painful but was actually, strangely, peaceful. Like a storm had passed, and the sky was clear for the first time in years. I went to Eleanor's apartment, the apartment on Maple Lane, a week after the reading. Alone. I let myself in with the key she had given me. The apartment smelled the same. Lavender and old paper. The armchairs were where they had always been, the green one and the blue one, angled toward each other by the bay window. The maple trees outside were bare. October had stripped them down to their bones. I sat in the green chair, my chair, and I looked at the blue chair, empty, and I let myself feel the full weight of her absence. Then I went to the bookshelf, and I found the journal, the leather-bound one she had asked me to read after she was gone. I took it to the green chair and I opened it. It started in the year David and I got married. The first entry was dated the day after our wedding. Lily wore a simple dress. She looked beautiful. She looked like someone who doesn't need a room full of people to know her own worth. Victoria wore white. I will remember this. The entries continued through all 12 years.
Hundreds of them.
Some short, some long. Every incident I remembered was there. Every Christmas candle, every Thanksgiving seating chart, every comment about my cooking, my body, my worth. Eleanor had recorded them all. But she had also recorded the other things. The things I didn't know she had noticed. The time I reorganized her medicine cabinet without being asked. The time I noticed she was limping and called her doctor before she could argue. The time I drove 40 minutes in a rainstorm to bring her the specific brand of Earl Grey she liked because the store near her apartment had stopped carrying it. Small things. Tiny, ordinary acts of care that I had done without thinking because that's what you do for people you love. Eleanor had seen every single one, and she had written them down like evidence, because that's what they were. Evidence of love, documented by a woman who knew that love without proof can be denied. The last entry was dated the week before she died. Her handwriting was shaky, barely legible, but I could make out every word. Lily came again today. She brought strawberries. She didn't know it, but I watched her arranging them in a bowl by the window where the light is good, the way Harold used to, and I thought, there it is. There is the proof that goodness doesn't die with the people who carry it. It just finds someone new. Everything is ready. Robert has the final documents. The letter is written. I have said what I needed to say. I am not afraid. The only thing I will miss, really miss, is the green chair conversations. But Lily will find someone new to argue about bread with. She's that kind of person. She doesn't know it yet, but she is. I was right about her. I was right from the very first night. I closed the journal. I held it against my chest the way Eleanor had held it that night years ago. And I sat in the green chair and looked at the maple trees and I cried until I had nothing left. If you've stayed with me this long, you know this isn't a story about money. It's not a story about revenge. It's a story about being seen. About one person in a room full of people who are too busy performing to pay attention, one person who stops and looks and says, I see you, I know who you are, and you matter. Eleanor gave me her estate, yes. But what she really gave me was the knowledge that 12 years of kindness had not been invisible. That every afternoon in that green chair, every bowl of soup, every book, every argument about bread, had been witnessed and valued and recorded by someone who understood exactly what it cost me to keep showing up. We used the money to pay off our house. We set up college funds for Megan's kids, just like I told Eleanor I would all those years ago, when she asked me that strange question in her living room and wrote my answer in her notebook. Megan never thanked us for it. I didn't need her to. I kept Eleanor's apartment. I didn't rent it out. I didn't sell it. I go there on weekday afternoons the way I used to, and I sit in the green chair, and I drink Earl Grey from the porcelain teapot, and I read. Sometimes I talk to her. Out loud. To the empty blue chair. The way you talk to someone who you know can't hear you, but you need to say it anyway. David and I are closer now than we've ever been. Losing Eleanor and gaining the truth she left behind broke something in David that needed breaking. He started therapy. He started drawing boundaries with his mother. The first time Victoria called after 3 months of silence, David answered and said, "Mom, if you can't treat my wife with respect, you can't be in our lives." That's not a negotiation. He said it calmly. He said it clearly. And then he waited. Victoria hung up. She called back 2 weeks later. She didn't apologize exactly because Victoria doesn't have that gear. But she said, "I'd like to try." And David said, "Then try with Lily. Not with me. With Lily. She's the one you owe." Victoria and I had coffee once about 6 months after the will was read. She was different. Smaller, somehow. The armor was still there, but it had dents in it. She didn't say sorry. She said, "My mother saw things I didn't see." Which isn't the same as an apology, but it's an admission, and from Victoria, an admission is a kind of miracle. I don't know if we'll ever be family. Real family. The kind where you show up not because you have to, but because you want to. Maybe. Maybe not. But I know this. Eleanor didn't leave me that money to punish her daughter. She left it to me to prove a point that she had been trying to make her entire life. That love is not a word. It's not a performance. It's not showing up when there's something to gain. Love is the green chair on a Tuesday afternoon. Love is strawberries by the window. Love is 12 years of knowing that nobody is watching and doing it anyway. Eleanor knew that. She always knew that. And now, thanks to her, so do I. And one more thing. I made the soup last week. The chicken and dumplings from the recipe card she gave me, the one she told me not to lose. I followed it exactly. Same ingredients, same steps, same timing. And I served it in a bowl at that little kitchen table in her apartment, sitting in the green chair, looking at the maple trees. I served it with bread. She was right about that too.